Well, I guess we'll get started since it's 8 and I don't want to keep you guys too long. But I am Austin Bly and I will be talking about sustainable agriculture and the case of the Norwegian farmer tonight. This is my presentation for my independent research final on the Norwegian farmer. And let's get into it. Just as a little outline here, I'm going to be talking a little bit about myself and the project itself as a background and why specifically this topic. Why did I choose sustainable agriculture and why the heck did I decide to study Norwegian farmers of all things, especially in the environmental studies department. And then I will go and talk about the theoretical framework that I'm going to be working with. I took a very political science approach to this, and I'll talk about some hypotheses in the new theoretical framework that I came up with for my research. And then I'll move on to the methods that I used for my research, and then the results in testing my hypotheses. And then I'll get to a short discussion at the end about what this may mean for Norwegian farming and the Norwegian farmer. A little bit about me. I'm a double major in political science and environmental studies. I also have a concentration in Nordic studies. A lot of my academic interests are around agriculture and environmental issues involved with that, and how we can improve the environment through systemic changes in the political system, specifically in agriculture and the food system and stuff like that. And this project itself I modeled on the criteria for this NERANT grant scholarship, and I started thinking about this last spring, and I was trying to figure out what was a good way to go about looking at sustainable agriculture, and I used this and have decided to look at the Norwegian farmer. And the project itself is twofold in what I actually looked at. First, I was exploring the idea of what exactly does sustainable agriculture mean to us, to Norwegian farmers, etc. And then also some more empirical research on farmer behavior in its relation to sustainable agriculture. And I'll talk about later how it relates specifically to environmental policy compliance. And first, we'll talk about specifically what sustainable agriculture is. And we'll do that by looking back at where sustainability came from, where the idea came from. And you can see there's a quote here from the World Commission on Environment and Development report. It was called Our Common Future. And they came up with what's probably the most well-known definition of sustainability or sustainable development. And it was actually headed by Norway's own Gro Harlem Brundtland, and who was the first female prime minister of Norway. And it basically is to meet the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And it's very focused on generations and looking towards the future of different groups of people, not looking at yourself necessarily. But exactly what those needs may be is very vague. And because of that, it's led to a proliferation of definitions of what sustainability may actually mean. But there are three main areas that have emerged since the 80s of what sustainability is, including ecological, economic, and societal sustainability. And I think a lot of us here at St. Olaf are pretty comfortable with the idea of ecological sustainability, what that means as far as the actual physical environment and ecology and things like that. But there's also economic and societal sustainability, which are more involved with people, obviously. And those can be things about being able to earn your own wage from the work that you do and be able to live off that, or being able to sustain a way of life or a culture or a certain identity without being stigmatized, and being able to gain equal rights and things like that. But as far as specifically sustainable agriculture, it's been a part of sustainability has been a part of a lot of different sectors of society, and so of course agriculture has also had sustainability attached onto it. and it's also had the same proliferation of definitions. And I think that this is most evident when you think about sustainable agriculture yourself. Like, even if you don't ever study sustainability and sustainable agriculture on your own time, like, just being able to try to think about what does sustainable agriculture mean to you, it's really hard to come up with like a specific idea for that. But in the academic literature, whenever anyone's talking about sustainable agriculture, it can really range from a whole list of topics, and I've got a few here. Food sufficiency, environmental stewardship, socioeconomic viability, and equity. Specifically equity, like about farmers and people who work on farms and things like that. And in the political sphere, a lot of countries around the world, specifically the developed world, have tried to implement these ideals from sustainable agriculture. Because they're noteworthy goals that we should try to achieve, I think. But in the developed world, a lot of literature recently has come out saying that, you know, we haven't really succeeded in trying to achieve these sustainable agriculture measures, or they perform poorly, etc., etc. And there is a growing body of literature now that looks specifically at what exactly is sustainability, what does that mean? And a lot of them say that it is because of this proliferation of definitions that we don't know what it is, that it's not very clear what policy initiatives should be. And in light of this, Baganatis argues, how can you accomplish something that you cannot define? And so, on top of this, farmers are probably the least well understood of what's called stakeholders in their definitions of what exactly sustainable agriculture is, which is kind of a problem considering they're the ones actually carrying out sustainable agriculture. And so, basically, to create better, more well-informed policy, we need to better understand exactly what farmers' ideas and definitions of sustainable agriculture actually are. And so that is why I'm looking at farmers, but I want to look specifically why Norway. And it's because it's a really interesting case study. You have Norway as one of the countries with one of the most successful environmental policy right now in the world. And I have these pictures of these bulldozers here from the late 50s to show that they have gone through the same challenges and problems with industrial agriculture as we have here in America. And they have pulled ahead in their success with their policy in less time and to a better extent than we have. So it's something worth looking at and learning from. And also, Norway has a relatively high level of social capital. And if you aren't a poli-sci major, even if you are a poli-sci major, you might not really know what that means, but I'll get to that in a little bit. But it also helps with the case study. And also, more logistically speaking, because of Norway's, in a way, intrusive manner that it collects information about people, there's a lot of, yeah, Norway's a big brother. There's a lot more contact information readily available that researchers can get for stuff like this. And so we'll get now into the theoretical framework. With the theoretical framework, I used a couple different models to look at, or to form a new theoretical model that I used to test. And the first one that I looked at is about social capital. And Putnam, his book, argues that social capital is made up of these three different things here: social networks, norms of reciprocity, and trust. And just exactly what those are, social networks are basically your connections with people. And you foster those connections basically by being a part of groups of people. Putnam points out specifically soccer clubs in Italy in his book here. He also talks about, in his 2005 book called Bowling Alone, about the indication of the declining rate of bowling leagues in the U.S. and how that is helping to degrade the social capital of the U.S. But anyway, the second part is norms of reciprocity, which is basically something like, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Or actually, it might be better to be put as, because you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours back now. And then there's also trust, which is pretty easily understood. But what's most important to understand about this is that you have a lot of different ways of categorizing trust and a lot of ways of distinguishing different types of trust. A couple different ways of doing that is between the individual, on the individual level, and on the societal level. Do you trust your best bud, or do you trust everyone in general? You also have societal versus government. Do you trust the average Joe, or do you trust Uncle Sam? They don't necessarily need to be different, but it's just different ways of looking at it. It's also trust between different groups of people, trust between us and them. And from these three different factors, social capital is, when it increases, it's likely to help overcome what's called collective action dilemmas. And that's another jargony term, but that basically is any sort of situation where where individuals can gain more by acting selfishly, but by sacrificing a little, everyone in society gains. We talk about this a lot in environmental studies as being like ocean fisheries or freshwater resources. But there can also be societal types of collective action dilemmas. Think about on the highway, when you're driving, and you have construction, and the highway is reduced only to one lane, and everyone has to merge over. And you have that one guy that decides to drive up to the very last point before he can merge into the single lane. But like, if you think about it, if that one guy were to merge where everyone else is, you actually probably save everyone on average time getting through that single lane area. So then collective action, I guess, just to define it, is behavior that can alter typical self-interested behavior to gain long-term benefits. And although it's very it's sort of based on like economics when you're explaining it, but with like benefits and losses and things like that. But it's not very easily measured economically, because these aren't, at least with societal collective action dilemmas, because these aren't very tangible ideas. But it's done in political science, at least, with surveys, where we can actually create measures out of these sorts of things. And just for everyone that's more visually minded, I created a couple graphs to represent what social capital actually looks like. And, sorry, so you have social capital here with the three different factors interacting with collective action, and the higher your social capital, the higher likelihood you will be able to overcome collective action dilemmas, and it feeds back so that then you will increase your social capital even further, and so forth and so forth.